All right, hey guys, welcome back to part two on chapter 8. I think last time we left off here at professionalism, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police in 1915, one of the more important resolutions approved at the meeting was an agreement for jurisdictional cooperation between cities and states. And this is going to become more important, and even it should be clear today that we need to have a common goal in law enforcement to share information and to work with each other in an effort to detect crime and arrest criminals, because obviously criminals don't care about city borders or county borders, and so it is imperative that we develop a good, long-standing relationship and cooperation between all the jurisdictions within a state. And so this became evident, like I said, back in 1915. So it became something very important to the profession. That was a sense of cooperation. Now, in terms of Southern policing, the end of Reconstruction also put an end to well-integrated policing in the South for the rest of the 19th century. Policing in general in the South would suffer as it reverted back to antebellum conditions that favored decentralization and smaller police budgets. And that would cause some problems because for decades, several Southern states paid their police officers very poorly, which often resulted in corruption and scandal. And one state that comes to mind, even as recently as the 1980s or 1990s, is Louisiana, which historically has paid their police officers very poorly, and police officers became engaged in different types of misconduct. There's even been cases where police officers have shot other police officers while on duty. The whole concept of professionalization in policing, not only goes towards the quality of the individual hire, but also the fact that you have to pay. You got to pay a good wage so you get good candidates, good applicants to work for you, and you have to make it worth their time. Because oftentimes, and this is even just as evident today, is a good applicant pretty much is in the driver's seat in terms of where he or she wants to work. Because everybody's hiring, and everyone wants that top-notch candidate to work for them, and so oftentimes applicants are looking at an array of factors and determining what is it that they want to work. Right. So again, Southern policing was still behind, and there may even still be issues today in terms of the pay in the South and the hiring practices and so forth. But this whole idea of paying a good wage has a tendency to limit corruption and scandal, although not all the time, because some large agencies such as NYPD or LAPD still have issues pop up every now and then that doesn't reflect well on the profession. So in terms of the West, the West was also another challenge. During this period of time, there are 4 types of law enforcement that would dominate the West, and it included vigilante committees, and this was particularly in mining areas. You'd have vigilante committees, legal citizens police, who were citizens serving brief stints as deputies and county sheriffs or town marshals. You'd have formal police and para-police, such as the Pinkertons, who pursued such known criminals as the James Younger Gang and so forth. So you had an array of law enforcement. So the West was obviously in a period where its law enforcement was lagging behind the East, especially in some larger metropolitan areas. And so the textbook on page 177 talks about these types of law enforcement that would predominate the West. In terms of corrections, during the Civil War, there were a few complaints of prison overcrowding or poor accommodations. The South utilized the convict lease system. We already talked about that earlier. because of a dearth in prison construction. In other words, during the Civil War period, many correctional facilities in the South were destroyed. So the South, after the Civil War, didn't have the resources to build prisons, so they utilized the convict lease system as a means to make money, as a means to increase revenue so they could build prisons and jails and so forth. The end of the Civil War and Reconstruction witnessed a sudden increase in America's state prison population, leading to several penal problems that arose. And so I think it's important to understand that, again, during this period, we're not only dealing with rising crime in some parts of the country, but we're also dealing with the need to construct new jails and prisons, especially in areas of the South. And so that's going to be problematic for that criminal justice system, primarily in the southern states. The reformatory area was a result of increased emphasis on reform. In other words, trying to find a level of punishment that would somehow allow prisoners to reform in their ways and become more productive citizens. And so oftentimes rehabilitation is tied closely to indeterminate sentencing, because indeterminate sentencing, for example, is a 5 to 15 year sentence, for example. And so a person has an ability to change his behavior and hopefully get out sooner if he does good in jail or prison, and he takes advantage of the different programs that are there to assist him or her in mending his ways. So this is going to become very important, this whole concept of indeterminate sentencing. Obviously, into the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s, the pendulum swung towards determinate sentencing, which is a fixed sentence. Now we're beginning to see a lot of talk about reforming our correctional system so that it goes more towards trying to deal with rehabilitation. So maybe the pendulum is swinging back more towards this idea of an indeterminate sentencing, or at least decriminalizing a certain type of criminal offenses. So the Declaration of Principles, which is adopted from the National Prison Congress, those are listed on page 178. So when you have time, please take a look at that. It basically is looking at steps towards reformation and focusing on the reforming of inmates, and not necessarily the punishment of inmates, but somehow we need to come up with a system, and even back then, that was going to examine how we can make individuals more productive in today's society. And so these principles were adopted, and you can take a look at those. Wayward Sisters, again, we were beginning to see in terms of this time period a change in the correctional philosophy, and one of those changes had to do with women and how do we house women who need to go to jail or prison for whatever crime they committed. We're also beginning to see women engaged in more serious crime that wasn't quite evident before. In fact, that is highlighted at the end of the chapter 8 on notable trials, where it talks about the trial of Lizzie Borden in 1893. Because during the first half of the 19th century, most female arrests involved prostitution, public inebriation, and petty larceny. But women tended to be housed where men were housed. And obviously, Wayward Sisters believed that there was a need for women to be treated differently in terms of rehabilitation and incarceration. And so the Indiana Reformatory Institution opened in 1874, and that was a result of a crusade by social feminists who campaigned for institutions suited to the specific needs of female prisoners, and obviously their needs are different than male prisoners. And if you ever take a class in correctional systems, you'll find that part of your course rather interesting in terms of understanding how women and men differ, and therefore how their punishment should be handled differently and their incarceration should be handled differently. Probation, which is a significant movement forward in terms of our correctional system and our criminal justice system. Its origin can be traced back to the benefit of clergy. Probation is considered the oldest form of non-institutional corrections in the United States. John Augustus is considered the father of probation, although Mr. Augustus had nothing to do with the criminal justice system. He was a shoemaker, a cobbler, and wanted to come up with different ways for society to deal with, I believe the bigger issue back then was drunkenness, and so came up with the idea of probation. It's popular because it's much cheaper than incarceration. On page 180, there's a discussion regarding probation, and you can take a look at it. That is whether there is an inherent class bias in probation. In other words, is probation mainly for certain segments of society over others? Now, back then, it might have been the case. Today, I sort of doubt that, as probation continues to be one of the more common types of punishment that we give for people who commit low-end misdemeanor type offenses. But you can take a look at that argument on page 180 of your textbook. Child savers and the birth of the juvenile justice system. Until about 1899, children could be arrested, detained, and tried and sentenced to adult prisons. That changed beginning in the mid-1870s up to the 1890s, when Massachusetts and Rhode Island passed laws authorizing separate trials for children. The first actual juvenile court was in 1899 in Chicago. Gave the criminal justice system jurisdiction over neglected and dependent children and those determined to be delinquent being those kids who commit a criminal offense. Key in juvenile justice reform was the child saving movement, and that's highlighted on page 181, so I would encourage you to read that section so you have an idea as to what that movement was. But basically, the child saving movement was mainly the purview of a group of well-educated, politically active women from the middle and upper class. And so these women in the child-saving movement coincided with an era when middle-class women were becoming better educated and enjoyed more leisure time. But because of social circumstance in the 19th century, there are few career avenues to follow. So they became involved in social issues, and one of those was juveniles. And so this movement towards a more fair and compassionate system of justice for minors began to take hold. And so we still benefit from that today because we have juvenile courts, we have a juvenile justice system which is separate from the adult criminal justice system. So that's an important aspect in terms of understanding was the social movement behind the child savers. Again, this was wealthy women who believed that we needed to make some significant changes. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about crime and punishment. You can go ahead and take a look at that. Obviously, as you can see here, the West, due to its lack of law or its lawlessness, had a significant increase in murder rates versus big cities, particularly those in the East. You could take a look at some of the criminalistics, or people who began to look at criminology, in other words, the study of crime, what causes crime, and some of the early theories that were out there. Basically, Lombroso said some men were born criminals. They suffer from some type of primitive ancestral features that make them become criminal. And he did this by looking at the face of criminals and their bodies types and began to take measurements and things like that. So you could take a look at that. Early as it was a whole idea that the fact that criminology was now becoming more recognized. And I'm not going to go into capital punishment. You can take a look at that, violence, lynching, and so forth. Anyhow, I hope this helps. Again, it was just a quick overview of some of the key parts of this chapter that I think are important. But make sure you read the textbook. All right. Have a good weekend. Obviously, if you ever have any questions or concerns, you can get a hold of me at any time. Okay? I appreciate it and have a good week. Bye-bye.